Thank you everyone for coming to this session of the Global Political Thought Seminar Series. My name is Yining Chang. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Government in Political Theory at Harvard University, and I'm a co-organizer of the Association for Global Political Thought. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our session with Professor Adom Getachew, who of course needs no introduction, but I will be superfluous and introduce her after this. The association is extremely pleased and honored to be able to host her today at a session that's also co-sponsored by the Harvard Sociology Workshop in History, Culture, and Society. This session is also generously funded by the Department of History at Harvard. The association, just to say a few quick notes, seeks to contribute to ongoing efforts in political theory to interrogate the field's constitutive exclusions and foundational boundaries. It hopes to be in conversation with ongoing work elsewhere to traverse not just geographic ground, but also crossing and recrossing thematic and disciplinary borders in order to continue to give life to a field that has some many questions to work through in this moment. Professor Adom Getachew is Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. She's a political theorist with research interests in the history of political thought, theories of race and empire, and post-colonial political theory. Her work focuses on the intellectual and political histories of Africa and the Caribbean. Her first book, World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, reconstructs an account of self-determination offered in the political thought of Black Atlantic anti-colonial nationalists during the height of decolonization in the 20th century. Professor Getachew holds a joint PhD in political science and African American studies from Yale University. She's on the faculty board of the Posen Center for Human Rights, a fellow at the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, and a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. Her paper today is from her ongoing work on Pan-Africanism and Garveyism. And just a quick note before we head into the session, before I introduce Shae rather, this is the penultimate session of our seminar series this year, but you might be interested to know that Professor Victoria Collis-Buthelezi, whom of course is cited in today's paper, is coming in a couple of weeks to present her work on translating Blackness and indigeneity, also to do with global Blackness and global Black political thought. Our respondent today, Shae Omonijo, is a PhD student in African and Middle Eastern history at Harvard University, where she works at the intersection of intellectual history, political theory, transnational feminisms, and cultural citizenship. Her research interests include the intellectual history of Pan-Arab and Pan-African thought, gender and sexuality in Africa and the Middle East, transnational Black feminism, and the intersection of reparations, art, and museums. Her ongoing work on Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism explores the intellectual and cultural history of women's role in the Pan-African movement of the 1950s and 1960s by investigating the ways in which women mediated tensions between a pro-Black movement that sought independence for Black people, regardless of geography, and a pro-Africa movement that sought to include North Africa in its definition of Pan-Africanism. This work seeks to create a new geographical space for understanding the dialectical relationship between Pan-Arab and Pan-African thought in ways that complicates our current understanding of borders, citizenship, religion, gender, and sexuality in continental Africa. It is my utmost pleasure to welcome Professor Getachew and to welcome Shae today. And without further ado, Professor Getachew, over to you.
Great. Well, first, just a sincere thanks to Yining, who has been working so hard both to set up this association and to make this particular session possible. I just want to say how grateful I am for the work she and others have done to set up this association, just because for those of you who occupy the field of Black or political theory, you will know that it's one of the few last holdouts in a variety of ways of a certain form of Eurocentrism. So I think this is really a necessary intervention, and I'm grateful to be part of it. I also want to thank all of you for being here today, and I want to thank Shae in advance for her comments. So I'm, just in the beginning stages of a project broadly on Garveyism, and that explains the various titles that you've seen floating around. So I want to apologize for that lack of clarity. But what I want to do in my about 10 to 15 minutes is sort of introduce the project more broadly, which hopefully will help to situate this particular chapter. And I want to do that by way of a vignette first. Allow me space in the most valuable paper of today to say a few words to my fellow Black men. It begins an open letter from Chief Takji of the Gold Coast in the January 14, 1922 issue of the Negro World. Chief Takji relays how he heard about the weekly newspaper from one Mr. H.B. Hall of Oklahoma. The correspondence with Mr. Hall, access to the Negro World, and the very letter from which he addresses his fellow Black men is made possible by the reading and translation of the chief's clerk, Mr. James Afari. Through Mr. Afari's mediation, he hears of the, quote, grand meetings organized by the UNIA in New York. And this is the reference to the UNIA conventions, the first one of which occurred in 1920, and a second one had followed in 1921. I wish I were there, he writes, but where physical presence isn't possible, the Negro World serves as a crucial link. I am the only chief on the coast here who is a subscriber, Chief Takji informs his readers. But to reveal its precious secrets to all the people, I have entrusted this work of translation unto the kind care of two native ministers who have to read and translate it for the chiefs and their subjects. To map the vectors of mobility, communication, and above all translation that link Oklahoma to the Gold Coast to New York and back again is to glimpse the world of Pan-Africanism that emerged under the sign of Garveyism in the 1920s. Named after the Jamaican Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey, Garveyism encapsulated a broad range of political ideas and practices that centered on racial emancipation and equality, and emerged from an analysis of white supremacy that linked the conditions of racial domination in the United States to imperial rule across Africa and the Caribbean. The institutional heart of the movement was the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, which Garvey co-founded with Amy Ashwood in 1914 in Kingston, Jamaica. By 1924, there were over 1,000 separate local divisions of the UNIA, concentrated in the United States and the Caribbean, but extending to Southern and Western Africa and as far as Australia. The precise count of members during the height of this movement in the early years of the 1920s is difficult to estimate, but at least one approximation by the leading scholar and archivist of the movement, Robert Hill, suggests that at least 6 million counted themselves among the ranks of the UNIA. Even when they were not card-carrying members of the UNIA, however, Garveyites, as they often called themselves, claimed a part in what they understood to be a global struggle against racial hierarchy and imperialism. So this is the kind of world that my new book project, tentatively titled The Universal Race, Garveyism and the Practices of Pan-Africanism, seeks to reconstruct and think through. The universal race charts the intellectual, ideological, and political processes and practices through which a Black world came to be imagined and enacted in the early 20th century. The universal race for me refers on the one hand to a geopolitical category and on the other to a political agent. In the first instance, it names the tethering together of a scattered race, which shares a common political predicament, what Garvey describes as a common grievance and a common complaint. The Negro World, the paper, the weekly periodical published from 1918 to 1933, sought to articulate this common fate by mapping a global landscape of both racial domination and the intimations of a coming revolution. This was a scalar imagination that encoded the local through the global. In this process, it mapped a Black world in and against other worlds. To speak of a Negro world in geopolitical terms was always a comparative project. It only made sense in relation to other worlds, whether that of the Anglo-Saxon world or parallel world-building projects, the pan movements of the same period. In the second instance, universal race names a political actor endowed with epoch-making political capacities. Here I take inspiration from the Universal Negro of the UNIA. The Universal Negro, like its counterpart and sometimes synonym, the New Negro, was a figure with a newly discovered political consciousness. Radicalized and awakened in large part owing to a growing internationalism, the Universal Negro was politically empowered, capable of remaking the self and the world. Understood as a subject of history and agent of politics, this idea of a universal race echoes Marxist traditions of thinking through the universal class. It names a figure of Promethean self-creation and world-making. And I'm interested in the project, in the practices through which this figure is cultivated and constructed. So the book is broadly trying to make two kinds of interventions. One is an intellectual history intervention, and it's trying to reconstitute or reconstruct the imperial origins and context of Garveyism. And so you see that in this particular paper, rather than thinking about Garveyism as a kind of culmination of a often US-centered story about a 19th century politics of emigration, it really thinks about the Caribbean, the West Indian origins, and African sources, West African sources, intellectual sources of the movement. So in a chapter that precedes this one, I examine in particular I haven't written it yet, but I'll be examining the same period of the late 19th and early 20th century, but from the kind of West Indian and specifically Jamaican context. So the first part of the book then is kind of focused on this intellectual origin story, and telling that in a kind of global frame. And then the second part of the book moves to the kind of political practices of Garveyism. And it's, rather than being organized around the political thought of discrete thinkers, it tries to think about the kind of reiterative practices and repertoires through which this idea of a kind of global Blackness or universal race was being constituted. And a first stab at that kind of focused on practices, focused on the convention form itself and on the staging and theatricality of the parades, performances, debates that occurred at the convention. So for me, this project is also an attempt to think more systematically about Pan-Africanism as a popular politics. So where my first book focused on a set of elite actors and a set of state-to-state relations, and its primary kind of spaces of action were like the high politics of the UN and other kind of international and regional bodies. This is an opportunity for me to kind of think more about a kind of a mass movement and to think about what it means to produce a political theory of and from a kind of mass movement. So I will end there and say I really look forward to your questions and comments. As I said, this is a really early draft. You're the first people to have read the chapter or taken a look at it. So I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Getachew, for that really wonderful and informative presentation. As mentioned before, I will be stopping the recording here so that we can hear from Shae for the response.